Okay, so ladies, gentlemen, I can catch up in time too, because we can speak a little bit quicker and go into details if you have questions. Now, for those who haven't heard me this morning, again, working for NATO, working in SHAPE, the military headquarters of NATO, located in Mons, Belgium, not to be confused with the main NATO headquarters, the political headquarters in Brussels, where our politicians and our diplomats sit. Again, this is a topic where I talk on what we experienced and what is happening, not necessarily the official viewpoint and the stance of NATO on this, just to make sure. Now, a quick agenda. As people might not be familiar with what we talk about, I will describe shortly our environment and the threats, what concerns us, go a little bit over malware, threat intelligence, and cyber intelligence, and then a little bit, this time I might have some answers of what we can do, and then if you have questions, feel free to ask them. Now, NATO networks, they look a little bit different to corporate networks, I guess, because we have a lot of unclassified as well as classified systems. The classified systems is where our command and control sits and where a lot of the information sits that the nations also, for example, share with us, and where the real meat of the organization sits. We have nodes in 29 nations plus now partner countries. We have special friends like Sweden, Finland, Austria, and others who are not NATO members but are friendly and out for cooperation and collaboration. We have multiple, very confusing, when you look at normal corporate application systems in use. For example, network spanning crypto network, which means if you have the same crypto key than us, we can talk to each other and you can decrypt the information. Now, sharing of crypto material, sharing of cryptos within the nations, making sure we all speak the same language is a science in itself. That means that's a huge issue, for example, with partner nations, because we can't just share no NATO crypto and key with just anybody in the world. When you look at the Afghanistan mission, for example, very interesting if you have various partners from around the world who want to talk to you on a mission-critical system near real time, and then that matters. We have some internet-facing systems, of course, because a lot of people, the PR guys, the finance guys, they all need to talk to the outside world, unfortunately, because that makes the networks at higher risk and a little bit more unsecure. We have some static networks. We have a lot of deployed networks. Best example, we have a lot of exercises going on. We have still quite a lot of missions going on. Famous one again, Afghanistan, to deploy the forward operating bases. We need to have mobile satellite technology in place. That's all a little deployed node, which needs to bring security with it, because if not, there's nobody to maintain security. And then, of course, the overall mission networks, which is, like I said, famous example in Afghanistan, where we have a NATO core network and connect with partners to actually allow the commander with all the troops and the partners to do the mission that they are supposed to do. Now, federation is important because a couple of years ago, some of you might remember General McChrystal. He decided that he needed to talk to his partners, and we all need to establish the same information environment. So that led to the federation of networks on the classified side, of course, to enable effective information sharing, and that is what matters most. We talked about it this morning. A speaker 2 sessions after me mentioned it again. Cyberspace is now an operational domain. That gives this a whole new different spin, because now suddenly we need to understand what happens if we deploy NATO CIS, or nations need to understand if they deploy national CIS, what does it mean to their CIS? What's the threat environment? What is the risk to the individual, to the system, to the information? So very interesting assessments, very complex assessments, because when you go into a cyber contested environment, what are the abilities of my adversaries? This starts an interesting discussion and an interesting assessment. We have, of course, the CIA principle, which is confidentiality, integrity, availability in a federated environment. That means the trust is shared and the risk is shared. The weakest link in that case is not the user, if you use that expression. The weakest link is actually the weakest network or the weakest component that handles my information, maybe provides me a service, but is at risk because the security posture is not at the same level we would like it to be. And that's later where the loop closes to malware, because if I have a malware attack in the network, a lot of this here becomes either questionable or impossible, or even worse, it gets tinkered with. Now, officially, we worry about NATO networks. That's what our mission is. When NATO talks about cyber defense, we do this for our own NATO networks. We are not in charge of national networks. But the nations, as I said this morning, have a high interest in remaining stable, remaining secure. Best example, what was issued last year, the Cyber Pledge, where we help each other to bring nations to the same security standard or to a higher security standard where they come from. Now, a lot of NATO commanders in the meantime have realized that the supporting infrastructure is of high interest. That goes into the national critical infrastructure. More than what I said this morning, here now we talk about fuel, water, food, sewage, etc. Take our example in Belgium where we sit. Yes, we have hardened facilities, you have generators, you have fuel, you have water, you have other things. If the Belgian main power would go down, it's a question of days until we go down. You become no longer sustainable if we lose the support of the national critical infrastructure. That's simply a fact. You can't prepare for that and can't forever continue your mission if the outside environment doesn't allow it. So this starts to matter and it starts to become important, and a lot of commanders, especially for exercises, now start to ask, what can I do about it? What can I do? How do I interact with my environment, with my partners, that I make sure they enable my mission? Smart technologies. A lot of presenters, I guess, talked about smart technologies. For us, that is a concern because that usually undermines your security posture. The Internet of Things, especially because you can't have anything talking to everything else, and don't look at the security, or some people tell you I can't afford to look at security because it doesn't fit the form factor or the battery or the design or whatever. That does not work. New technologies, of course, expand the attack surface, nothing new for you, hopefully. And a big issue is we need to master the old. We haven't solved the problems of the last 10 to 20 years, and now we add more and more and more at a faster and faster and faster pace, and we interconnect all of this just because some people say we need to talk and we need to connect and this saves me money, so let's go. That for us is a huge problem. Now the threat environment. Corporate environments, I think, have similar problems. I don't want to say we are more important, but we have special considerations. Information leakage, you all have seen that. If something spills out of NATO, it hits the press and then there's a huge fallout. How could this happen? And national secrets now exposed or NATO secrets exposed, and our adversaries just laugh because for them this means data is freely coming to them. We also share, as I said before, on our mission networks a lot of mission relevant information with our partners. Now what happens if the information gets played with or gets manipulated? If the content is no longer true or can't be trusted? That is an interesting problem. We share, for example, a recognized air picture with our partners, which means we tell partners what we see in the NATO airspace and where we would pick up adversaries should they decide to do something. What happens if a fighter plane suddenly is there and in reality doesn't exist, or one that exists gets deleted, or out of 10 I make 100, or vice versa? That's an interesting problem. Now, information destruction, even more so, because, yes, for a corporate company, they lose money. We might actually lose lives. Because if people can't access the information, we have a problem. And that's the modern effect of a ransomware or something that acts like a ransomware and in the end wipes the data. The goals of our adversaries, of course, you discredit NATO. If the nations lose trust, lose faith, then they wonder, why do we do this? What's the value of the alliance? We have to worry about terrorism, espionage, sabotage. As I said this morning, if I can target any of you, unfortunately, we live in a time where such information becomes of value, because you heard the Islamic State. They go ahead and say the lone wolf now, the individual, is supposed to target the infidel and leave his message. That's where all this car attacks, knife attacks, axe attacks, and all the other crap comes from. That means if I can profile you and if I find enough information, I will target you and I will kill you, and I've delivered the message. Excuse the drastic words, but that's the environment at the moment we have to face. Be it in Belgium or be it somewhere here. They are coming to us if they aren't already present. Subversion, that's out of the old spy movies, but that still works. We have countries out there who try to subvert NATO members or national members that go to NATO in order to get to the information. Can be malware enhanced. Of course, interference with mission success, I mentioned that. You can manipulate data, kill data, destroy it, hinder access, and in the end, the goal of hurting or killing personnel. The insider threat, again, in the corporate world, I think the same thing. In the corporate world, it's usually you want to get access to the information either now or later. For us, again, a problem because this can have mission-critical effects, or it can affect the whole mission of NATO and why it exists. You have, if anybody paid attention to the news in Germany in the last couple of years, Der Spiegel, famous magazine who managed to get a hold of a lot of interesting classified NATO documents and then published them, of course, usually to say negative things about the alliance. That usually comes from an insider who either doesn't agree with the NATO mission or with that mission in particular or that tasking, and then feels they need to talk to the press and share this information. Now, for us, an insider is, of course, the random user who makes a mistake. It can happen, usually not that bad. Disgruntled employees, we have the same problem. Somebody feels overworked, not respected, not being paid enough money, and then suddenly he decides to do something about it. Subverted members, again, some people not happy with their end of career, and there is a choice, there is a way out, and you suddenly work for somebody else and make your second career. And of course, the deliberate placed foreign agent who then will do something on the network or in the environment. And then, of course, we have problems on the insider threat. Afghanistan as an example. For example, green on blue, where your so-called allies suddenly take up a weapon and start shooting alliance members or NATO members. You heard that in the news, unfortunately, too, where the Afghan or an Afghani decides that doesn't continue the way it goes, and now I kill those who are here to help me. The insider threat, of course, for us, we have 29 member nations, we have partners, you have a lot of contractors, you have cleaning personnel in the facility, you have, because we have a base that is like a US base with housing, with a school, with a hospital, with the police, fire brigade, etc. We have hundreds of visitors a day on the base, which means the insider is very hard to monitor. 1/3 of our personnel rotates every year. Rightly so, because it's their end of tour and they go back home and new people arrive. But that shows you that insider monitoring, as sometimes advertised by industry, is very, very hard to implement because we burn through people very quickly. If anybody believes spies don't exist, wrong. This is just an example of a couple issues recently. I mentioned before the Islamic State kill list. That was open source information which the Islamic State collected. This was against the Americans with names, email addresses, locations, private addresses, etc., what they could find. And the message was, go out there, target them, kill them. That's the environment for us, why a spillage is very, very bad, because again, it can hurt and kill people. Herman Sim, he was an Estonian spy, he was a disgruntled employee from 2009, but the case is still being discussed, it's still being used as an example. He had access, because he worked for the Estonian NSA, to most classified material, to crypto material, other things. He was at the end of his career, and guess what? The Russians said, if you're not happy, we can help you. You make a further career, you make more money, join us. He did. He didn't make a mistake, his handler made a mistake. That's why he was discovered. But again, if technology and networks support you and you have malware on the system or you have privileged access on the system, you are enabled. The Portuguese gentleman, he was arrested last year because he was suspected to be a spy, and to sell information to our adversary. So we actually have, if some people believe James Bond and all of this is fictional, yes it is, but to a certain degree for us it's reality. And I must admit, with Hermann Simm, I sat with him in conferences years ago. He attended NATO counterintelligence meetings and other things because he was by his position entitled to, and he had the most privileged access. We can spin this story further if you are interested, but this is not movie material. This is for us reality. Now malware becomes for us interesting because we had a lot of events that you see in the world. Best example, the last couple of years, ransomware. NATO got affected by ransomware. We hadn't been targeted, but we saw the side effects of ransomware trying to infect the systems. That's why we are interested in sharing information with partners. We want to see early on what's happening when malware is still malware, and the context of what happens with it will follow. If it turns into a criminal tool, if it turns into an espionage tool, that doesn't really matter. The earlier we know, the better it is for us. And of interest is, especially when we start profiling the guys who design and compile malware, their TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, remain the same. We are interested because that leads to attribution and that leads to identifying what's happening maybe before it will affect us. You all know malware recently turned into ransomware, data locker, data wiper, espionage tool, crime tools. We have hacktivism, which is political activism, but online and conducted in the hacker mindset and hacker environment. And for us, unfortunately, crimeware is, again, like the ransomware example earlier, hitting us not directly, but more on the sidelines. But it is still as dangerous as if we would be officially targeted, because if we lose data, it can have disastrous effects. Now, if you're familiar with Shamoon, what it did to Saudi Aramco, that would be a huge issue for us, because if we had thousands of machines suddenly locked and the information no longer accessible, even worse, our server environments, it doesn't matter if it's static or operational, that would be a huge disaster. Recovery might take us a while because resources are not in an infinite supply. The same for ransomware. We had, as I said, isolated cases of ransomware, knocking on wood luckily, without proper backups, without procedures, without, somebody earlier this morning mentioned it, business continuity plans. We wouldn't be in a situation to just continue business as usual, because we would be down to pen and paper planning. Now, some of the older soldiers, if you ever went to the military, you might remember you learned planning with pen and paper. But in modern days, take PowerPoint away, the magic tool of a staff officer. He is, at the beginning, lost. Take all our digital information, digital maps, and other generation and planning tools away, and there is a problem. There's a significant delay, and to recover all of this out of nothing without a warning is pretty difficult. FMV is full motion video. We have terabytes of information shared daily on what satellites, what balloons, what other environments see in mission environments. You can't replicate that if you have no longer your IT available. So you're without that information, that doesn't work. The same for timely intelligence sharing and other things. And with ransomware, it's bad enough that industry in some cases actually puts in a budget to buy their way out because it's cheaper than setting up the proper procedures and the expertise and the backup technologies that would prevent that in the long run. And that happened, for example, in the UK, where companies foresee a budget to buy back information, unfortunately. Now, threat intelligence, malware. Malware is technical. Indicators of compromise are being shared. For example, in the middle we have Malware Information Sharing Platform, a Belgian tool, where we share information with partners. After we see an IOC or after we see some information, we want to also be able to put this all into context. And you all know you can buy threat intelligence. If you go to the latest vendor conferences, you see threat intelligence is on the forefront. A lot of that is technical intelligence, not really what I mean with the actors and the effects and the events behind it, but that doesn't matter. We do the same thing. We share it with, as you see, with industry, academia, nations, partner nations. We share it with others. We have an agreement with Europol, for example. Even so, we are non-law enforcement. Europol was happy to talk to us, and what they can share will be shared. We talk to the EU CERT, national CERTs, etc. Commercial feeds, here it's getting interesting. You know the big vendors, Symantec does that, for example, Threat Connect has it, FireEye, CrowdStrike, etc. Those tools are really valuable because they suddenly put your technical information, the malware, the IOCs, the other things, into a context. And you must, before a panic breaks out or before your chain of command, or in your case, the different boards and other levels, fall into a hype, you must contextualize the information of what you see. What does this mean to us? What does it mean to our deployment? What does it mean to our mission or to our company? If not, you see data and it becomes disruptive or it's useless because you shouldn't even worry about. Now comes something interesting. When you look at the other domains, if you're familiar a little bit with the military, you can buy Janes. Janes is a military publication where you can look up the military of Estonia, of Latvia, of the Russians, the Americans, everybody. Their weapons, technologies, ammunition, etc. Doesn't exist for cyberspace. So we want to have an intelligence capability which puts what we see on the networks, which puts IOCs, malware effects, actors, groups, activities into a context. A commander at some point for us will ask, what does that mean? And that question we need to answer, or we should be able to answer it. The 5 W's, the famous questions. At the bottom you see we take another approach because we take the counter IED. IED is an improvised explosive device. There is usually a human behind some kind of malicious activity. For now there is a human. Once it becomes an AI, we have a problem. But at the moment a human becomes targetable. So if I have intelligence on activities and I can pinpoint an entity, I can take an action. Because a commander might also ask, what can I do about this? And suddenly there are options, because if I know the human element, I can do something about the human, and we leave it here. Protective measures for us, hopefully the same for you. We have layered technology and layered defenses, which means you have different nodes, you have different technologies, you have different levels of controls and checks where data needs to go through, hopefully catching what the other one before that misses. We have not only your cybersecurity tools, we worry about document security, physical security, personal security, etc. We worry about the whole 360-degree defense of our information, the systems, and the personnel behind it. We have a forensic and analytical capability, of course. We have partner agreements. We share information with the partners, as I mentioned earlier. We have a counterintelligence capability, which looks actually into the human element. What can we do about the human? Have we seen that before? What might be his intention? We use different technologies. You know that even from private environment, corporate environment, one malware scanner might not be enough. You choose another malware scanner on your Exchange server or somewhere on a gateway because they have different results, different technologies. And of course, we have policies and other things in place. Business continuity for us, disaster recovery, that's nothing new. That is being done for years, and we just go with the flow and keep adjusting so that even if something happens, we are not surprised and we pull out a plan and say, this is how we will carry forward. Same for incident management. A cyber incident should never surprise you. Now, risk management, also interesting. The same for a company. You need to understand the risk. You need to understand the threat, and then you need to work on that. For us, interesting, we need to understand the operational context. To give you an example, a denial of service attack against a public-facing website. It's unfortunate. It might need an explanation of why this happened and why it went down. But if the commander asks, how does this affect my mission? The answer is, it does not. Don't worry about it, we got it. So the operational context needs to be understood before we can then offer risk management type decisions. We need to understand dependencies, of course, what is maybe affected in addition to a simple website. Then we design the context, we report the risk up the chain of command because we don't own the risk and we don't make decisions. And then, of course, that allows effective resource allocation because for us as well, there is never enough. So we need to focus on where we have attention, where we pay attention, and what comes back first. For example, in a disaster recovery plan, you should have priorities of systems and technologies that come up, because if you start asking once things are down, everybody will say, I'm important, I need mine first. So that needs to be planned in advance, and then you can effectively manage the risk. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I am done. Questions?
No, Holger, that was a masterclass. Thank you very much, sir. I would only say I actually sat next to Herman Sim for about 6 months. So I was a political advisor in Estonia, and I never guessed, which just shows how stupid any individual can be. I should have done, but I didn't. And you sat next to him at conferences, I'm sure. But anyway, thank you very much, sir. Is our next speaker back here? Thank you. Oh, I've got to give you another certificate. You're going to get, so that's 2 for today, and 2 lots of gifts. Yeah, you get 2 lots. That means you get 2 mugs. Hold on.
Thanks a lot.